Thank you so much for coming out and joining us tonight. I felt like the weather was against us this weekend, but fortunately at night we're still chilly, right? So everybody can come. I would love to have you welcome Meg Gardiner and Tess Gerritsen back to the Poison Table. So, Tess, I'm going to put you over here. That's you. Yep, it'll be wonderful. And we have a really, pardon me for turning my back to you all for just one moment. We have a lovely surprise for both of you, which is Stephen King has sent them flowers. Isn't it great? So if you all have your camera and you would like to take a photo of the two of them by the flower, here's your moment. And then please turn off your cell phones and no flash.
Who's got the camera there?
I do. Okay. Wow, cool. Wasn't that a nice surprise? So, proving that Stephen King reads as many books as he writes. Does he? And more. Right. In any case, tonight is the publication night for Meg Gardiner. It's her third unsub book, but a book with a new publisher, and she has lots to tell us about it. It's also, Tess and I were reminiscing in the back, we launched your first book, right? Your first hardcover. When was it?
1996.
Wow. Oh my God! So we've been together forever.
We have, I know, and it was there was a great deal of faith for you to have a need, somebody who had never really done much in terms of writing, and you asked for me, and here I came, and ever since I seem like I've been here every year.
Yeah, because I ruthlessly pursue her, and yeah. Tess has a secret, not very secret past as a writer of romances for Harlequin. Some of you may remember that before she became a somewhat dark and history writer, she did write some romance. So are any of them still in print? Because I thought Harlequin never let go.
They're all in print, at least digitally, and every so often they will re-release those. So yep, they keep coming out.
Did you use the same name?
Tess Gerritsen, yes.
Right. And so Tess is a doctor too, which I think also a physician, which also makes it possible for her to write really authentically gory scenes. However, you don't have that excuse.
No, I'm an escaped lawyer, so
just as bad.
So people say, where does the darkness come from? And well,
we both know, right? Yep. I know. I escaped the law at 45, so I could be a bookseller, and here's Meg as an author. But Meg has had an interesting career track because she's been out of the country for quite a lot of it. So we've had to work hard to get you here once in a while.
Yeah, I'm a Southern Californian. Lived most of my life in Santa Barbara, Bay Area, Los Angeles, and then my husband was offered a job in London, so we moved to the UK with our 3 small children and lived there for many years, which is where I started writing. I had the time, the kids were out of diapers, and I went without having a job waiting for me, so I knew it was time to put up or shut up and try to write. And that was also where I learned that my impressions of California were not the same as probably the rest of the world. That I thought that Santa Barbara was it was a great place to grow up, but I just thought it was ordinary. You know, it was sunny weather, but it was just a really nice, ordinary place to grow up. And of course, I arrived in Britain, and all these people are looking at me like I've walked off the set of Baywatch or something. I drove up in a dune buggy with guns blazing or something, and they were like, "Tell us all about it." So I
sunny weather would not have been a feature of life in Britain.
No. So I decided to set my books, and my first books were set all in Southern California, and I figured I could write about a place I loved and convince my new friends that I really lived that life, even though I'm only on the page. But,
so Meg did very well. Her paperback won on Edgar for Best Paperback Original. And remind me, was that your first book?
The first book in the Emma Delaney series, China Lake.
It was, but was it the first book you published?
It was, yeah.
Wow.
So.
So you kept going. Well, who wouldn't? I know. So tell us a bit about The Dark Corners of the Night, which is the third in your unsub
Yes.
series.
The Unsub series is they're psychological thrillers featuring a young FBI agent, Caitlin Hendricks, who is a profiler in the behavioral analysis unit, like Mindhunter, Criminal Minds, and she hunts serial predators. She is tenacious and sometimes obsessed, and knows that there are very bad people out there, and who won't ever stop doing what they want to do. Somebody else has to stop them, and she's that person. And in this novel, she and her unit are called to Los Angeles to assist in an investigation into a home invasion killer who calls himself the Midnight Man. He sneaks in under cover of darkness, kills the adults in the home, and leaves any children unharmed as witnesses to tell the tale. And he likes to leave symbols and writing all over the walls. He draws eyes all over the walls. He tells the children to repeat after me, "I am the Legion of the Night," and then he disappears like a shadow. So his attacks are escalating. The LAPD and Sheriff's Department are at the point where they need some help, and so they call in Caitlin's unit to come and try to analyze the behavior of the criminal and stop him before he really goes to town. I based it very, very loosely on the Night Stalker case. All the books have had some kernel of reality to spark the story. And I am from Southern California, and I recall what it was like in those days when this killer was at large, and nobody knew who he was, where he was. It seemed like there was no way to stop him. I mean, the days were sunny and pleasant, and then the sun would go down, and he owned the night, and there was no way to keep him out, it felt like, because everybody has to sleep sometime. And there was no way for you to guard against him 100% of the time. So it was kind of a pall of dread over the entire, southern half of the state. And I remembered that, and I thought, okay, that's a starting point for a story about who is this person, why does he love to spread this kind of fear, what's he getting out of it, and how on earth are the authorities going to find out who he is and stop it.
It's really amazing how an entire city can be unsettled by that kind of a crime. I had to go to Washington to interview Many Hillerman at one of the National Book Festivals, and it was the year that there were the 2 serial shooters in Washington, remember that?
Yes.
And they had moved the National Book Festival out onto the mall, which was, a vast expanse of grass. And I still remember Tony turning to me. I was there because he had lost his hearing by then, and he couldn't interact with the audience, so I was there to talk to him and interpret, so to speak. And I still remember he turned to me just before we went out on the stage, and he said, "Remind me," he said, "why are we here?" And I said to him, and I thought it was true, that we probably had more security because of the book festival than anyone else in Washington at that time. But there was just a horrible feeling of, fear, and we had a serial shooter here in Phoenix. Do y'all remember that?
Yeah.
Which was, totally unnerving. So, your depiction of a community just completely rattled is so
and
true.
Even the cops got rattled.
Yeah.
They were putting, people that, they sold out of burglar alarms. There was like a 3-month backlog on who could install a security system at their home. People were putting bells on the gates to their backyards so that if someone, an intruder came in, it would,
Right.
There was not a single dog left in a shelter anywhere, I think, in the Southland. Whether they were, German Shepherds or Chihuahuas, they were taken to try to protect them.
Little yappy dogs can work really well. We had a burglary in our community, and amazingly, there were like 11 dogs that appeared the next week. Mostly small. It's not fair to have a really big hairy dog in Phoenix. For one thing, they clog up your pool So we have for you not a Rizzoli Isles, but we also have maybe a serial killer. but you're on the coast of Maine. What interested you in having a cookbook writer as your protagonist in The Shape of the Night? I just loved it.
Well, it didn't start off being about cooking at all. It ended up being about cooking. But I was inspired by the ghost stories my mother used to tell me when she grew up in China and she believed in ghosts. She saw ghosts, right. And so I always grew up with the sense that maybe they're around. Maybe it's possible. So it's not too surprising. My mother's favorite television show was The Ghost and Mrs Muir.
Do you know about moon gates?
No.
Do you know why there are moon gates in China? I learned this in Xi'an years ago. You know
Tell me.
No, seriously, you know how they're round and they have a very steep thing? They are so the ghosts can't go through the gate. The ghosts would have to, apparently ghosts can't do this, would have to step way up and go over the big step through the moon gate, the round moon gate. So I thought that was fascinating. You're so right. It's a big part of Chinese culture.
It is, and so anyway, I grew up with this Ghost and Mrs Muir, and I loved that show. And I've always loved Gothic novels, and I thought, here I live on the coast of Maine, where I think the Ghost and Mrs Muir feels like it belongs in the sea captain's house, and we have so many sea captain's houses in the area where I live.
Right.
So why not do a kind of a dark retelling of the Ghost and Mrs Muir, which is a very troubled young woman who has a horrible secret, is really fleeing her past, and she goes and she rents this house, a sea captain's house, and the sea captain is still there 150 years later, and she falls in love, or let's say they fall in lust, let's put it that way, and now the question comes up, is he real? And number two, why is it that every woman who's ever lived in this house has died in this house? Oh, no. Is the ghost responsible, or is something else going on? So I just wanted to play with the idea also of what makes the perfect lover. You know, because I used to write romance novels, I've thought about this a lot. and maybe the perfect lover is not a real man at all. Maybe your fantasy lover is always going to be better than any human being
This
can
guy
be.
leaves no trace.
Well, not only that, he can't get you pregnant, he can't give you STDs, he doesn't need breakfast cooked the next morning, he won't leave his clothes lying around, and he knows exactly what you want in bed.
Because this sea captain was lost at sea. He went down with his ship, right? So there's that added element too.
And you know, all these fictional sea captains are always real hunks. So that was so it's a completely different kind of book for me, but it was fun. It was a change that I felt like I needed to do, just to refresh myself before going back into crime fiction. Although this is a crime novel.
No, it definitely is a crime novel, but there's a whole revival thing going on about Gothic fiction and horror. We're seeing lots of classics being reprinted. Lots of books are now coming to me from publishers described as Gothic. It's always seemed to me that a major element of the Gothic is the house.
That is, I mean, there's
Rebecca,
right.
Whatever, you know.
Well, there's three elements. There's the heroine, there's the brooding hero, and there's the house.
Right.
You have to have all three.
So, you know, the fact that you had her rent, the cookbook writer comes to this small place on the coast of Maine to work in solitude over the summer and flee her past, but she rents this amazing house. And so the minute you see the house, you think, right. So I thought, that was fascinating. Did you design the house yourself?
I based it on a lot of captain's houses that we have in Maine. A lot of them have what we call widows' walks. And we think of them as being where the captain's wives would go up and see if their husband's ships would return, when in fact they actually had a very practical purpose. They were there to put out chimney fires. So if your chimney fire was, if you had your chimney caught on fire, you had to go up there and you had to be able to pour water down the chimney, and so that was what the widow's walk was really for. I'm sorry to ruin that for you.
A romance writer has just ruined it. Honestly, Tess. The one thing I thought I was teasing her in the back that we're missing, however, there are no recipes. I know, that you have a cookbook writer and she's working away in her kitchen and testing things, but there are no recipes. So maybe for the paperback you should figure out a recipe or two.
Yes. Well, there's something about, sensuality is not just about sex. There's something so sensual about food, about the act of cutting on a board, the things you hear, the things you smell. And my father was a professional cook. He had a restaurant. So I grew up with well, I'm also Chinese, so of course food is really important to us. And I think all that spilled out when I was working on the character of Ava. She's in the kitchen, and you think about what is it like to make risotto. You know, it takes, you're standing there over that stove and stirring and stirring and stirring and thinking about things, and all these things are going through your head while you're waiting for the rice to soften. That's a very, very sensuous experience to be in the kitchen with those smells coming up.
Very rich broth goes into risotto.
Yes, warm broth.
That's wonderful. My husband maintains that the best seduction scene he's ever seen in a movie was in Tom Jones. If any of you remember the movie Tom Jones, and the food. I mean, it's pretty basic eating, right? They're gnawing away or whatever it all is, but definitely. Yeah, you're right. I hadn't really thought about it so much, but you're right. It is
food and sex; they all go together.
Right, wrapped up in seduction. All right, so
I'm pretty hot now.
follow that, if you will. All right. So, to have a serial killer, you have to create some sort of a profile for the guy. Do all serial killers have to be what's the word I want? Psychopath, thank you. Psychopaths?
They do not have to be psychopaths.
Okay.
But, I mean,
are they scarier if they are?
Possibly. I mean, fictional serial killers are probably scarier if they are, because the word psychopath carries such a heavy burden that it's like it's attaching a label to them that already deforms them in people's imagination. Whereas in real life it could be it's a mixture of nature and nurture, and who knows what kind of neurology is involved with it. But we say psychopaths, like people will say he's a psycho, and that sometimes it may carry in real life. Does it carry a moral implication? Whereas in the story, it's meant to be that someone's a scary bad guy. Many real life psychopaths are not. They're not serial killers. They're low level con men and con women, and they're really screw ups because they just can't keep themselves from misbehaving constantly and losing the next job and running through all the money they've borrowed and wrecking their dad's car again or something like that. But the worst of the worst are people who simply have no conscience at all. And it's maybe it's a matter of their the way their brain is put together, that's part of it, but they literally have no conscience. They're incapable of empathy. They can't understand how other people feel, so why should they care about anybody else? In their minds, their personality structure tells them that power is what counts.
Your view?
I really learned a lot from this book called Confessions of I think it's called Confessions of a Sociopath, which is essentially the same thing. And it's written by a woman who is a sociopath, and she has a website, and it's a support group for other sociopaths who want to know why they don't fit into society and what is their normal. And I have to say, I mean, I agree with you in every way, but it's also fascinating to see that they feel that they are an abused minority as well, because they don't have that capability of empathy and what's wrong with us, and why why do we always get put down as a bad guy when it's just the way we are? It's the way we were born.
So if you have a murdering psychopath, in an era when the death penalty is largely off the table, these are people who are really not subject to rehabilitation, are they?
Well, that's a good question. Whether there's anything that can encourage them to change their behavior. Punishment does not generally convince them to change their behavior. These are people who also, it may be a matter of the neurotransmitters in their brain for some of them, where encourages risk-taking behavior. That where you or I could walk outside and see this unbelievably beautiful sunset and feel like all warm and fuzzy and get like a real sense of well-being, for a sociopath that literally has no effect. they need to put the pedal down and drive 120 miles an hour. Some certainly young men to physically feel excitement and the rush, and then they don't know how to put on the brakes. So the question is how to structure their lives so that they could change their behavior, and that's an extremely difficult question. But yeah, rehabilitation is probably not the word for it.
Control is really the answer. I think they have to know that there are consequences to doing bad things. And I think that is really what causes them to stay on the straight and narrow, is they know that they'll get caught.
Well, yeah, and they talk, you hear people say that, like, he was out of control. I couldn't, I just was a homicidal maniac. I couldn't control myself. Strangely, these people, like 99.9% of the time, if a cop was driving by when they had the urge to murder, somehow they could control themselves.
Yeah. So why is it you think they escalate? Because that's part of the story that you're writing, is that there begins to be concern that he's going to keep escalating.
Right.
Other words, killing more and more people.
Killing people more frequently, crossing self-imposed boundaries over, what kind of, who is an innocent that he would try to not kill. It's like anything, you get habituated to it, and you've taken your first step into committing crime, then the next step, you want the bigger rush until pretty soon you just want it all the time, and sometimes for serial killers, sadly they can spend months, even years, planning, thinking about their crimes, committing a crime, and then living off the residual, the memories that they can draw up again in extraordinary detail. But after a while,
Is that why they often take souvenirs?
Yeah.
Or trophies or whatever they call them, because it helps them, to relive.
They can keep. They've got their little memorabilia collection. Then they can go and look in the closet or out in the trunk or wherever and refresh their fantasy. But eventually, those memories fade, and they decide that they need something else.
So when you were thinking about the serial killer in this book, what kind of serial killer did you want to create? Because there are obviously many different kinds.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to talk too much about this because I'm giving it away. But what I really wanted you, the reader, to think is there actually a serial killer involved? Is this person real, or is it possibly something supernatural? And how much of it is that my heroine is going totally bonkers? She's going crazy. Because she is dealing with this incredible amount of guilt that is coloring everything she sees, and possibly she's the one who's punishing herself the most. But I was thinking, I always love these, Murder, She Wrote, where everybody gets killed, somebody gets killed. Yeah. So there's something about small towns. This is the other thing, is I wanted to make my killer, if he exists, a small town killer. Who are these people? Who do you trust? And I live in a town of about 5,000 people, and what's fascinating is one of the most trusted people in our town. He was in charge of gathering money for our local charities, was stealing it all. And he was given the label of Citizen of the Year the year before he was caught. So clearly a sociopath, because he didn't really need the money. He just was doing this. And so what came out of that was, you're living in a small town. You think you know people. You think you trust these people, but what do we really know about them? And that's what I really wanted to get under your skin, is that, there are big scary serial killers out there whom you don't know, but maybe the person who's most dangerous is the person you do know.
Good point. And also, if you're writing in a small town consistently, you can't depopulate it. So, that's the flaw with Murder, She Wrote. Meg has a way bigger canvas here. Now, I was asking you because, I think our justice system is not what it was when Agatha Christie was writing. You could be pretty sure how it would go for the killer once the killer was caught. But it doesn't necessarily work that way anymore. So, in thinking about your killer, I think you almost have to also think about, the very end game for the killer.
Well, yeah, and as far as fiction and how how a law enforcement officer would respond to the thought that the killer might never be punished properly.
Possibly, or is it better just shoot him and get it over with, or
Right, yeah.
I mean, there's a lot. I don't know whether there's some sort of moral. If you create somebody so hideous that it's not capable of reform, as an author, do you have some moral obligation to take this person off the table?
To erase them on the last
Yeah,
page.
I don't know. I'm just idly thinking about it. I was thinking about it in part because after I read your book, I read Peter Swanson's upcoming book called 8 Perfect Murders. And he goes back to 8 classic murders is the structure for this book. And all of them were written at a time when capital punishment was, in fact, if you were caught, that was going to be it, right? So none of these more interesting questions.
Well, yeah, then we get into
up.
vigilantism and
I know.
Judge Dredd, and that's not who Caitlin is, but I don't want to spoil
Absolutely
anything
not.
as well, but she starts to analyze the person that the unsub that they're hunting, and which requires a cop to put themselves in that person's shoes and realize that they are a human being and try to figure out why they're doing what they're doing and realize, would this person ever stop when confronted by the police? Would they turn their gun on the officers? Would they surrender? Would they not? And forces her to think about the end game, which she finds extremely.
Well, there's some enduring questions. Why did Jack the Ripper? I mean, why did he stop or disappear? Did he die? Did he move? Did he go somewhere else and nobody in those days saw the pattern repeating? So we don't know, what that was all about. Or was the guy in Kansas that quit for
Dog catcher.
forever? And that's so atypical, apparently. For them to go dormant.
Then the guy in Wichita, BTK,
That was
Rader,
it. Yeah.
He quit for a long time, but then a newspaper posted a retrospective on his crimes, and he
Got him going again?
Yeah, they got him going. They kind of said, well, he's the loser who's gone away and something he thought, no, I'm going to have my grand return, which set him up to be captured.
Very narcissistic. I'm from Kansas, and
Me too,
it was
yes,
terrifying.
It's just interesting, what are the triggers and, for people like that, why, as you say, why did they turn to killing as opposed to like dog napping or,
No, because in a book we can have all the killings we want, as you know, but no dog napping.
That's true. Sorry, I should have brought up the dog napping. Or as Tess was saying, just, like steal money from charity and so on. There has to be a huge element of rush adrenaline addiction or whatever version of that. It has to be in part an addiction to the rush or to power.
Completely, yeah, and power and control is a huge thing for a lot of these people, so, yeah.
So,
Let's not forget that we're talking about gradations. There is a really horrible, scary sociopath, and then there's a more common sociopath who becomes a banker.
Or a lawyer.
Yeah.
surgeon.
But I mean, I think that one book that I was mentioning before looked at, I think it was the percentage of each profession and what are they, which ones are most likely to be sociopaths. And a lot of the ones that are most likely to be sociopaths are those that are involved in making a lot of money. Again, it goes back to power. That's power, and so they tend to be focused on certain professions. You're not going to find many sociopaths who are social workers. They just go into that field.
And again, like you said, there are gradations, and people are wondering now what turns someone toward violence and crime versus investment banking and having the corner office. And sometimes it is, were they raised in a nurturing, very attentive home with parents who showed them a way of a loving life, and that can really make a difference to some people.
I often think about Dickens and Oliver Twist, because you take a really dreadful situation and yet one person can come out of it really well, a good person, and other people are totally twisted, but the nurture was equally horrible. So it's really tough to know. That nature-nurture question is, I think it's impossible to answer.
Well, makes for a good book.
It does. So one of the things you've got going on though with Caitlin is, in addition to the specific killer in this book, there's this kind of ongoing threat from somebody else.
Yeah, it's a series, so the series now has its own arc. In the first novel, Unsub, where she was still just a homicide detective working her first case in the Bay Area, hunted down a legendary serial killer with traits like the Zodiac. And again, I don't want to give it away totally, but the case was not completely closed at the end, and she found out that there was a continuing thread that went on with someone who was still out there, who was extraordinarily dangerous, and has let her know that he knows who she is and where she works and how to get in touch with her, and that she may think she's all that, but she's not.
The ongoing menace, you know, which is really, I think, really important in a
Yeah.
series. You also have an interesting personal relationship going on, a long distance kind of a thing,
Well, yeah, we're hoping
which I really like.
Yeah, she has a boyfriend, Caitlin. I mean, she's like total dedicated Fed now, but she's got a boyfriend. He's kind of hunky. He's not even a ghost, and she still doesn't know. So Sean, her boyfriend, he's an ATF agent, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives, which is the E is silent in that agency. It's actually ATFE, and he's an explosive specialist. And so they, but she took a job in Washington D.C. She took a job at Quantico, so he's still in the Bay Area with his daughter. So they're trying to figure out. They said we'll make it work out. Everything's going to be fine, and that's easy to say and harder to do. So they're working on it.
You already know something about distance going. I think it's just an interesting thing, you know, to have them trying to work out that kind of relationship. But it also means that there's additional threats that can arise because he can be a target as well as she. So you've got more to work with.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. That's it. You got. I mean, in real life, I would love for them to like read a book that's full of recipes and just stay at home and like pet the dog and watch binge watch some like easygoing comedy on TV, but that doesn't make for a thriller. You've got to have them. You've got to have them in personal jeopardy. Otherwise, it's not actually a story. So.
Well, you have to have lots of conflict, and it can come from all kinds of things. It can come from chasing the killer. It can come from their relationship. There's almost always jurisdictional disputes when you've got multiple law enforcement agencies, and they can be butting heads.
Right.
And
It's fun.
just a wealth of material, right? You can tell she was a lawyer. Right. So we haven't talked about Rizzoli Isles. I love this new book, and I think it was fun for you to write. But catch us up.
Okay, so I finished the 12th book, which was I Know a Secret, which was about a sociopath, actually, except she doesn't, well, not in the story anyway, she doesn't kill anybody during the story, but her past is checkered. And so then I wanted to write this ghost story, and I have been wavering about what the next book is going to be, and I've been talked into doing a 13th Rizzoli Isles story, with a little bit of a twist. It's still going to be Jane and Maura, but Jane's mother, Angela, is going to be much more prominent in this story. I love the fact that her mother has always been like, the lady in the kitchen, she's cooking, she babysits, but does anybody really give her credit for having brains, for maybe seeing something that she thinks is wrong, something bad has happened and nobody believes her? So it's going to be Angela, sort of like a sleuth, and trying to convince her daughter that a crime has been committed. And it's going to be taking place very much in Angela's neighborhood. I love the idea of older heroines. I just feel like we don't see enough of them. And it'll be fun to write a story from the point of view of a divorced 59-year-old woman who's having a love affair with Detective Corsack, and trying to convince her daughter that yes, she can be a crime fighter too.
So, are you always thinking about stories, either both of you? Is that just constantly like you're never alone at dinner? You're always there's always three of you at the table.
At least three.
At least three. No, I mean really. So even while you're writing this book, you're still thinking about Maura and Jane.
Absolutely. I mean, they're real people to me. It's just that sometimes I want them to go away and leave me alone. And then of course I'm also doing other stuff with my son. We just finished our movie about pigs. I think I might have told you about that before.
Tell us more.
It's called Magnificent Beast, and we search for the history of the mystery, the historical mystery of why Jews and Muslims don't eat pork. What is the real reason for the pig taboo? And we go to Egypt and we we travel to England, talking to scholars and searching for the answer.
I always thought it was trichinosis.
Yeah, that's what everybody thinks. That's not
Ah, girl, yeah.
no, we take care of that issue in the film.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's no trichinosis in the UK, by the way. The pork and
There is?
it's not a problem. No, it's not an issue.
Ah, so
Never
it's
been an
not-
issue in Southeast Asia. They love pork, and they have never cared about trichinosis there.
Well, hanging in the air is the thought that maybe it's what they eat. I can feel it. Uh-huh. Well, that'll be fascinating. Do you have questions for each other before we turn it over to the audience?
Well, okay. I read Unsub. I haven't read this one yet because it hasn't gone on sale yet. Today is the first day, so it was unavailable. I want to pick a bone with you, and that I was so. How many of you read Unsub? Has anybody read Unsub? My favorite character killed her.
Yeah,
You know Daryl, right?
Yes,
Okay.
I do.
All right.
Yes,
So,
okay.
so did you get any flack for that?
Well, tonight I am. I have now. I've been skating on it for a couple of years. Thanks, Barbara.
Come on. How did I know? I should
No,
have
you know what? I actually that was hard, and there are times I don't like to kill characters that I've come from, and occasionally they've been rescued at the last second. But I realized several years ago when I was writing that I was protecting the characters that I had a particular affection for. And if you're writing a thriller, that's not a good thing to do because you're hamstringing yourself about where the story can actually go. So I decided that I was going to start threw away the net, and I decided that if I knew these people, I was going to be brutal. That anybody could die if they stayed in danger long enough and put themselves out there. But, yeah.
You
Sorry.
think you're also babying readers in the sense that, there's no real fear. If somebody can die, somebody important, then the safety net for the reader goes away too.
Yeah, and that's a tricky thing because readers don't come here to have like an actual terrifying experience of the book. They want to be entertained, and they trust that we as authors will take them on a journey or a roller coaster ride, but the roller coaster will eventually come back around. It's not just gonna like fly off the track halfway through. That it actually does return to the station. So they do trust us not to turn into some kind of like nihilistic nightmare at the very end. But
Just don't kill the dog. That's all.
I mean, it's a weird thing that, that you can kill any number of people, but if you kill a pet, it's a disaster. And I wonder, do crime readers come with the idea that human life is disposable, or is
humans
pet life is not?
humans have free will, and they place themselves in this situation somehow, and some of them deserve it. But even the yappiest little chihuahua doesn't deserve that fate. So.
I had to give a speech once for our local humane society, and the title of the speech was "Don't Kill the Dog," and talked about how artists, we can kill any number of women if we kill a dog. And movie makers also know this. Remember that book? There was a movie called
Old Yeller.
No, Old Yeller. It was a movie where the aliens come and take over and destroy everything. Anyway, there was a dog named Boomer in that book, in that story. Right.
Independence Day.
Right, Independence Day. Right. It was Will Smith's dog, and the dog does. I have to tell you, the dog does survive, but it's not really clear because you don't see the dog after a certain point. And I understand that the producers got so much flack. I mean, all of humanity is wiped out in this movie, and all the the viewers were upset about was what happened to
The
Boomer.
last time you see Boomer is when like the flames are blooming behind him, and he's like leaping over a tunnel full of wrecked cars with his master calling for him. So you just have to hope that Boomer.
I wrote a book called Playing with Fire, and I did kill a cat. And this was a book about the Holocaust.
It's incredible.
This was a book about a whole family that gets wiped out, and the thing that everybody complained about was the cat died. So that was it was really a lesson to me that something about animals. I think their innocence, their helplessness for all of us. That's what bothers everybody.
They rely on us, or certainly domesticated pets. Okay, I do have a question for you. is, this book has been bought by Amazon Studios for television, so do you have any suggestions or advice for me?
Enjoy it. No, really, I think the best thing to do is just don't get. What I learned is not to get too wrapped up in your version of the story, because it will invariably change, and you just have to, hang loose and just cash the checks. That's all.
I think you're lucky, Meg, in the sense that are they doing it for television or are they doing it for a movie?
Television.
If it's television, you have a much better chance, that it will be at least some of it your story, because a movie just you can't compress a book into a movie. We've had a lot of discussions about this over the years with authors, and I think the general feeling is that television is much better for books, turning them into film because of the serial nature.
Yeah, it becomes novelistic. You can have a season.
Well, you've got hours instead of a very short time. So that's
It's a better sales tool as well. I mean, a movie is out and then it's gone.
Right.
And a lot of people will think, well, I've seen the movie, so I don't need to read the book. But with the television series, they get connected to the characters, and they miss the characters when the show is on, and so maybe they'll go to the books.
We had a really interesting discussion the other day here about, I think it was Saturday, about how many books you think you've read. You actually saw the movie, and you didn't read the book, or whether you should read the book before or after you see the movie if you have not. And it came up in a number of contexts. Rebecca was one.
I was just going to out myself on that.
And Gone with the Wind was another. We had an author who actually confessed, Charlie Finch, had never read Gone with the Wind, and so his question was, should I read the book or see the movie? It was unanimous. Read the book. Read the book first, and all. But I mean, but it's a different discussion, I think, when it's television.
I'm happy to have it anytime.
So tell us more about it.
Amazon Studios has bought
The series?
The series for development as an hour-long television drama, and this is all very new. It's the executive producer and showrunner is Lawrence Trilling, who currently is the showrunner for Goliath with Billy Bob Thornton. So he's going to be in charge of development, and I'm attached as a producer, and we'll see what that ends up meaning.
Any of you watch the Jack Ryan series on TV, the
Yes.
1 and 2? Don't you love it that Tom
Yes.
Clancy is attached as the executive producer?
Yeah.
He died in like 2012. I love it. So I'm not too sure what the job of executive is. I think we're back to Tess and Ghosts. We really are. But it's interesting. Michael Connelly just said that the 7th season of Bosch would be the last one. Craig Johnson dropped in last week in the middle of a cozy event we were doing, so that was hilarious. He had his own hat for the hat contest. And Longmire reached its 6th, I think, and then that was it. So it's hard, when you get attached to some of these series. But they seem to all, if you notice that they all seem to come to an end around season 6.
Some of that is financial.
A lot of it's
Yeah, a
financial.
lot of it has to do with the stars now want to have a pay raise, and then it becomes expensive.
There are triggers that go off apparently
Right.
at season 6 that make season 7 so prohibitively expensive that
Or
by
the actors
time
have
they
other-
drop it.
yeah,
Or
wanna
the
move on.
actors have. I'm mentioning that to you just in case you didn't
That
know
would
that.
be a problem I wouldn't be willing to take.
Oh, of course, I know, I understand.
In 7 years.
Yeah, right. So it'll be fascinating to see what happens. We're really excited.
I am too.
You don't have any idea about the casting,
Not
right?
yet. Not at all.
No.
So-
So what's going on with Rizzoli Isles? Are they?
Oh, the television series ended after 7
I knew
years.
that it did.
Yeah. We're
But is there a possible movie? Because sometimes that's what happens when the TV does well.
Let me tell you what we're doing.
Okay.
So Sasha Alexander, who played Maura Isles, had got in touch with me last year and said she wanted to continue the character for another show. So I wrote the Bible for it. I wrote
Okay.
the Bible for the next series, starring Maura as a crime writer who moves to Italy. So the whole thing would be filmed in Italy for the first season.
Ooh.
And we got all the way to the Netflix boardroom, and they said, no, it's a little expensive for us. So we dropped it, and then it turned out that Warner Brothers has not dropped the idea. What the problem was that using Maura as a character makes the whole thing a lot more expensive because there are people who have the rights to that character, and we would have to buy them off. So now we're going back to the drawing board. The idea is still that it's going to be about a crime writer who's writing in Rome. And the idea is that it would be Murder, She Wrote, but the book itself would also come alive. So every season you see the writer writing the story and solving a mystery in her own life, and you also see the character of her book solving her mystery in her life. So it's like this double mystery throughout the series. But what we loved was the idea of what is it like to write a mystery and to struggle with it and to get inspiration by whatever crime you're investigating in your real life and end up in your book with a different character.
I love it. I edited a book which is coming out in April. It's called After She Wrote Him. And it is about a mystery writer who creates a character and then that character sort of comes to life. So it's a very similar thing, and I think it's fascinating. It won Australia's Edgar. It won the Ned Kelly Award. Ned Kelly, see The Hangman? No, that's the Canadian one. Arthur Ellis was the Canadian
Ned Kelly
hangman.
was an outlaw,
Wasn't he? Yeah, I was trying to remember. Right. Anyway, so I that's a fascinating thing to play with.
Well, I think what really drew everybody into the story, especially me, was that way it would be set in a different country. So every season would be a different country. My writer starts off in Rome, and so the story takes place in Italy, and then the next year would be maybe a different country.
No travel for you, of course, involved in this,
No,
right?
well.
No tax-free travel. I love it. I'm going to say thank you to our video audience for watching us. We appreciate it, and we can now take questions.